On this episode of the show, I have with me Alex Schlager. He is the founder and CEO at AIceberg. We're going to be talking about hiring out of college, and actually, they've got a pretty interesting system. We're going to be talking about that relationships they've built with universities and being able to create talent pipeline right out of school. We're going to talk to them about some of the challenges of hiring for challenging skills and why this path has helped them. And we're going to also ask them about some of the challenges. It can't all be easy, but what is? So, Alex, thanks for joining the show.
Well, thank you for having me, Amir.
Absolutely. All right, tell everyone what you guys do over there before we dive in.
Sure. AIceberg is an AI trust platform, which means we process real-time traffic that is, going to an AI, coming from an AI, or you could think of it as, monitoring AI interactions. And we look at safety, security, compliance, and observability. In other words, we help companies adopt AI by basically eliminating the risks that are associated with the usage of, generative models or, AI agent or agentic AI.
So this topic, I guess, kind of came about. You guys are in a pretty interesting space, and obviously you need some of the tech skills and technology hires that everyone who's in the space or moving in the space will need. I guess when we just maybe start off at the high level and talk about some of those challenges within your world, some of the challenges of trying to hire for these emerging tech skills, these AI skills, these development skills that are very sought after even in this market.
Sure. So we started almost 2 years ago. And as you can imagine, to your point, AI or generative AI, I would rather say, was an emerging tech, still is an emerging tech. And getting talent to perform research and product development is very hard because there's scarce resources on the market, and those resources are respectively expensive, especially for a startup to hire. So we had a very clear idea about the research we want to conduct, in which direction it should go, but we realized we simply don't have the manpower, womanpower, the capacity to carry it out at the pace that we wanted to.
Absolutely. I guess, being a startup, some of these skills, large companies are trying to hire for them, smaller companies, other startups. The competition in the last 2 years with the number of startups, looking for this talent has just exploded. I mean, I in a recruiting company, I can definitely tell you I've seen it, even though, the market as a whole has gotten a little softer, not in this space. I guess the one question within that is, it's an emerging technology. There's a lot of moving parts. Obviously, if you have more work experience, maybe you understand how technology gets applied. But when it comes to something that's newer, how do you kind of correlate someone with just more work experience versus someone that has less experience but more concentrated in, whatever the technology might be?
Yeah, great question. It comes with overhead, right? So the first thing I would say, our model would have never worked if we wouldn't have the buy-in of the faculty. So part of this, this cooperation with the University of Houston, for example, there's more universities today, but we started with the University of Houston, was that we had 2 faculty members who actively worked with us, not only finding the right students, but also coaching the students on the subject matter, in this case, machine learning, artificial intelligence. So that was one important pillar, that the students not only knew the faculty, from when they were doing their bachelor's or master's, but the faculty was also available on site at the university, kind of to provide guidance as to the research agenda, priorities, problems the students faced from a subject matter point of view. So I think that was one of the pillars that was really important to make this work, to have a close, cooperation and buy-in with selected faculty members. The other point is it comes at a cost, and the cost is that you have to provide more coaching and more hand-holding than to your point, if you would hire an employee that has 4, 5, 6, 7 years of work experience. So the model normally was that we started working with the students more or less a year before they graduated for their master's program. So they were working in our lab at the university, 20 hours a week. And this is how they combined, their respective fields of study with practical experience in our lab. Many of those students are fixed employees with us today, but we spent a considerable amount of time in these last 2 years providing coaching and kind of getting them ready for the workforce independently if they ended up with us in the end or not.
Interesting. I guess talk about that overhead. So obviously, if you bring in an experienced hire, somebody has 10 years experience, 2 years in whatever technology you want versus someone who's done it on paper. You mentioned the overhead. Talk about the overhead to to the existing team. Startup moving in a very fast-paced environment as well. I guess tell us a little bit about how your management has to adjust or change to, incorporate just more junior or younger, less experienced talent.
Let's start with patience, right? We often assume things to be given if you work with somebody who has experience in the workforce. So you have to have patience and some empathy that, these young folks never have, done that or been in that situation. I think that's the first point. The second point is be smart about who knows what in your organization and who should help them. For example, our development team, which exists of quite some senior folks, we would basically work with them and understand who can coach which student on, matters like code hygiene or how to produce clean code or how our, code development and submission processes work. So ideally, you find a good balance across your existing and more senior team in terms of which tasks they will take on, knowledge transfer or when it comes to specific coaching of students. So, obviously at the beginning, things were a bit more bumpy because we haven't done this, before. But I think 5 months into that 2-year journey now, we kind of established processes, we established standards and kind of best practices, as there was a, permanent influx on a 3-month basis of new students coming in sense of how do we onboard them, how do we perform knowledge transfer, and how do we get the basics out there, if you like. And that's a team effort, not a single person.
Yeah, I mean, patience is probably where it all starts. I mean, and you've been in this process now, a couple of years you mentioned. When you're looking at kind of the work, and typically if you were, and I don't know if you guys are running things, Scrum, but typically if you were at a different company and there was different seniority of engineering leaders and engineers there, that estimation process goes one way. With younger talent, I mean, it'd be a little bit harder to depend on them to figure out scope and time and effort. And I guess when it comes to planning in your roadmap, like does anything change? Actually, that's maybe the question one, is going through sprint planning and just roadmap planning. I mean, what changes when you're, bringing in a lot more of this and, early stage talent?
I'm not so sure if it's much, associated with the talent rather than the nature of the business, let's say. For example, we're extremely research heavy company. So we spend, 55% of our time and money on research. And I think that dictates the pipeline, the processes and the tools that you want to use, right? And then you basically introduce, in this case, students, to that pipeline and process. Practically, this means we have a JIRA board for software development, like everybody else does, but we have also a JIRA board for early stage research, right? So where we structure and organize students and faculty in the areas that we're interested in from a research perspective. We have a second board then where we transfer successful research and experimentation towards the software engineering team. Then there's another board for product management and software development. So part of automating it and standardizing it and maturing it was to really be focused on that pipeline from the early stages of, hey, I have an idea, we should research X, Y, Z, which is managed in a separate board. And, something works out or is successful, it moves into another board where we prepare it, test it, and then hand it basically over to product. Product plans it from a prioritization and feature point of view. And ultimately, it ends up in the software development JIRA board where the engineers and I actually building the features there. And, standardizing that and introducing rules of engagement and using, for example, a Confluence to document these processes. That was kind of the way we standardized it. And we also decoupled the pure software development, product development from the research. And to my earlier point, we had these individual stages that something would mature through and where you have respective control over progress, etc.
Interesting. I guess when you're going through this process of, you have relationships with schools, who do you contact? I guess if somebody's listening, going, hey, this is interesting, at least interns or whatnot, I can, approach a school, maybe build a relationship. Who do you reach out to a career center? Do you reach out to the dean of whatever department you're trying to target? How do you go about that?
It depends on the university. So some universities are not, are not driving such models or such engagement models, very actively. Others do. So there are universities who are actively looking for partnerships with industry, right? Because they recognize the benefits for the university, for the students, and so on and so forth. Often it is the department chair that will drive such activities, will drive such initiatives. So in our case, we were introduced, or I met the department chair at University of Houston, Professor Lendas, who is one of our lead researchers now, and we basically discussed the idea, the model, the setup, the conditions. Then the dean was involved at one point, and we were off to the races 2 months later. So I'm not sure there's a general answer who you should contact. But I think the first step is getting an idea which universities are actively engaging and interested in corporations within this.
Interesting. I guess you said you've been doing this for 2 years. What are some of the learning lessons? Because obviously something like this sounds like, there might be opportunity to stumble a little bit. What are some of the things that you've learned over the last couple of years in hiring very early young talent out of colleges, or even as interns?
The biggest lesson probably was when we interviewed students in the early days, we were really focusing on the subject matter in sense of, how strong are is their academic track record? How strong of a research support would they provide? We tested them on machine learning principles, things they should have learned with their bachelor's and master's. I think we should have taken a bit more focus on, do we believe that that person will mature into how should I phrase that, into an employee that is willing and capable of following corporate cadence. So my point is, you can have the most genius individual from a subject matter point of view, but if that person is not able to work with other people, accept processes, and standards that you introduce, ultimately, the fact that that kid is, highly intelligent, highly talented, will not help you in the long run. So we did have cases where we hired brilliant students, and after 7, 8 months, we simply had to part ways because they wouldn't accept or wouldn't know how to work in larger teams and accept that, companies had rules and there's rules to adhere to. So what would I do different? I probably would have done different, that we put more emphasis in the interviews also on that aspect of, their growth and their process of maturing into the work.
That's interesting because I think, for a lot of people, they tend to, especially at startups, pay more to hire an experienced person because they figure there's less time invested, less effort to manage. You guys have gone the other direction, and obviously you're paying a fraction of right now a senior engineer that back end that does really well with integrating with LLMs. I mean, they're 200K. If you can get one for less than that, I'd be impressed. You're paying less, but you have the bit of an overhead to ramp them up. When it comes to retention, because I think this is where you probably have a huge advantage. Obviously, a senior has to go to a principal. I mean, there might not be a principal role at your company, in which case you might not be able to retain that person, or it might be difficult given hierarchies or salary structures. When it comes to hiring for younger talent, entry level can become, a mid-level engineer, then a senior. The career ladder is a little bit further to go. How has that factored into just your overall retention, your strategy when it comes to wanting to retain the talent that you're potentially bringing in earlier in the company?
One thing we advise the students, graduates, before we hire them is look for a job and see what's out there and get an understanding of what you would be doing there, right? Because to your point, we we wanted them to have an understanding of, well, what are the benefits if I start with AIceberg, and how would I fare if I go somewhere else? So we encourage them to, to basically look into the market and see what's out there. And the one thing they came back with is, to your point, well, we probably can get a higher salary than with a startup, but we're going to be one of 300 people there, and we're going to be in a cubicle, not literally, but you know what I mean, in sense of very locked in, as in this is your task and this is what we want you to do, and we don't want you to look left and right, and they quickly realized that from a career perspective, from a learning perspective, they would be better off in a startup because the rate of learning, the experience, the diversity of topics they will be dealing with is way more beneficial in a startup than if you join a large company where you're one of 300 or 500 or 1,000 engineers and developers. So that was one of the key drivers, and the second piece is we took the time and sat down. I'm still doing this, obviously, in sense of a good career path, right? How can we make sure that their time at AIceberg maximizes their CV and their further career path? Don't get me wrong. I'd love for them to stay with us forever. But I think we also have a responsibility to make them competitive generally in the market and not only for our own.
Curiosity, if somebody does leave, out goes with them some of that, the learned experience, the tribal knowledge, all those things that startups kind of like to keep sticky because it's expensive. Have you guys found a way to manage that? Because obviously some people might go, oh, I do want to just take the job, couple of grand, or whatever the factor is. But how have you guys factored for the younger talent maybe leaving a little bit more frequently than more senior talent?
We're lucky. So far, we have not been in that situation. So everybody who joined us is still with us. But the answer is probably twofold. One, rigorous documentation, right? To your point, we're moving very fast as a startup. Documentation is one of the most important things to do, not only on the coding side, equally on the research side and in other areas. The other thing is, once a piece of tech becomes mature, we don't want, those folks to work on that or maintain that anymore because they're researchers. They should move on to the next big question we want to answer from a research perspective. So normally we use the more junior inbound folks to basically learn that area, take that area over because it's more about, optimization and maintenance than bottom-up research. And the more senior people then move on to the next research topic. So to your question, if one of them would decide, hey, I want to do something else, the documentation will be important, but also the fact that somebody is moving basically to backfill this already. This is how we try to de-risk that situation.
I mean, it certainly sounds like a very good system. I don't hear it very often, but also I think what I do hear a lot is people waiting 6-8 months to find that right hire. In your case, how quickly do you onboard somebody? Like what's the entire process look like from, identification of obviously you have to have the relationship with the university. That let's just say that's in place. What does the hiring kind of life cycle look like time wise?
So in the earlier days, we would use the help of the faculty to point us to talented students that we should be talking to. By now, as we had over 30 students move through that funnel, and as I mentioned, we employed many of these, it's well known that this partnership exists. So we have more and more students reaching out to us. If we decide to work with a student, the onboarding process is probably 3-4 days, besides the general admin things that need to be done. We normally assign them one of the more senior employees or senior data scientists. We look at the incoming student preference or particular strengths that they want to be working on, and then we basically buddy them with an existing employee, and normally outline the first 3 months of what we want them to research, to do, to work on, and so on and so forth. The students then either stay with us until they graduate. The students stay with us until they graduate, after which they either, pursue their own job aspirations, or, in many cases, they would join us. Obviously, we can't do this forever, right? We also have limits from a budget perspective in terms of how many data scientists we can maintain on staff. But this was so far the model that we have been pursuing.
It's very interesting. I love it when I hear of a novel way to hire and kind of address some of the challenges in the market. I think it's really an interesting one that doesn't get spoken to about enough. If somebody does want to maybe reach out to you to pick your brain on this process in particular, what's a good way of connecting with you?
Just drop me an email, Alex at AIceberg.ai, and happy to have a chat. Let me drop one more thought that I mean
Sure.
touched upon. So we talked about the cost and the overhead of onboarding somebody who has not been in the workforce yet. But don't underestimate, especially in research in emerging technologies, the benefit of a fresh brain, right? What I mean with that is, if you work with somebody who has, worked 10, 15, 20 years in machine learning, for example, he or she will have certain established ideas or concepts or ways they think about a problem. If you work with a student, when I say fresh brain, is they often look at problems in a very different way that you might not have, come across yourself. So we often had the experience that we would look at the student and said, well, that's interesting. We'd have never thought about it this way. And it happened more than once. And I do think this is a particular advantage, if we talk about cost, then this is definitely something which is we should consider on the benefit side.
Interesting. I actually think that's a really good point. I'm glad you clarified. And we definitely will include your contact information in the show notes, because I think for a lot of people, they might not have thought about this. And I think it's a great avenue for them to explore. So we'll definitely do that. Alex, thanks for taking the time. Thanks for sharing something hopefully new to a lot of people. And I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Amir.
Absolutely. All right. That's the end of this show. Be back again. Different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, I'd love for you to share this episode to somebody else who might be in a similar situation. I don't think you have to be a startup, but I think it might lend itself well, especially for emerging technologies. Alex walked us through his process of working with universities, what they do when they hire someone, how they kind of fit that person within the context of the team, and kind of where they fit in, and retention as well. I think Alex walked us through a lot. I'm sure we didn't exhaust it. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to him. But definitely share this episode. I think there's value in it. Also, like, subscribe, comment. Let me know how the show's going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.